you always bring up the stories that we've always heard about the adversity, and we had an experience which wasn't good, and what probably defines someone, or certainly you want to tell the next bit of the story, which is this is what we did, and we regrouped and we managed to do this and this, whatever that is. So probably that's what we need to do now, because like I said, many teams have been beat 9. We have. We need to try and tell the story in a positive one, that we showed character and showed real resolve, and that's the main drive now.
And what's more, you'll be a Mason, I think, was how Scott Parker was going to end that press conference there. Very big Mike Bassett vibes, maybe 3 cheers for Ramirez as well at the end of that. But a dreadful weekend for Bournemouth, ending with Scott Parker becoming the first Premier League manager to be sacked this season. Joining me to break down that, look across all the rest of Matchday 4 and look ahead to Matchday 5. And we've even got a little bit of a sneak at the end of something for you at the end of the show as well. Duncan Alexander, Matt Furniss alongside me on this cloudy, overcast, beginning to feel a little bit more autumnal day here in the UK. Thanks for watching.
Didn't know we did weather reports.
Yeah.
It's my great hope one day I'll get to do a weather forecast, I tell you that. But I tell you what, it's certainly black clouds glooming down at Bournemouth. That's where I was trying to get to with this.
I see.
Yeah. Just jumped in before.
I thought you were trying to make it feel like it's like November, so that Scott Parker might think he hasn't been sacked in August. But
well, I tell you what, a man who wears a cardigan in August, brave call, especially after this August as well. But
in the heat wave, he wore it during the heat wave. He stuck with it.
Character
building. And unfortunately for Parker, first managerial sacking of the season. My brave call that only 4 Premier League managers are going to get sacked this season, very much looking in the mire, because 4 games in, obviously it's a slightly truncated start with this World Cup winter coming up as well. But so it's not the first time a Premier League manager has been sacked after 4 games. But in terms of actually earliness in a season, it's actually not that early compared to some other Premier League sackings.
Yeah, Matt kindly pulled together the numbers this morning, and we put out an article on the Analyst. And yeah, Parker's in and around the top 10, but he's no Paul Sturrock. You can see there he went very early into 2004 or 5. Yeah, it's some names you would expect to see there, I think, and then some that maybe people have forgotten. I mean, it's interesting to see how many Newcastle managers are in there. I mean, Newcastle don't hang around. I think Eddie Howe will, breathe a big sigh of relief if he can get to September this week and still be in position. I think he probably will. But it's one of those things, isn't it? When a manager gets sacked this early, you get a lot of people saying, "Well, it's too early in the season." But essentially, if you don't think it's working, then the earlier you do it, the more time they have to turn it around. And I think. I mean, part of me thinks if you lose 9-0, you should automatically be sacked, because it should be like a trigger point in football. But then Ralph Hasenhüttl has certainly shown that you can bounce back in some ways. But it sounds like it wasn't really the 9-0 that did it. It's more of a disagreement in terms of recruitment and squad strength and stuff. You guess? Yeah.
After the game, he pretty much said we're crap. So how can we come back from this? That wasn't going to help a little bit. I think that was the problem.
We do actually have the soundbite of Parker talking about the signings, which we might get to in a minute. But we did put out as the tease for the show as well. But yeah, that's my reading of it. You basically can't turn around and say to your ownership in press conferences that we need to recruit more players and we're not going to be good enough at this standard, and kind of expect to still be in a job.
I think Dunk said that about us too, though, didn't he?
Well, repeatedly, especially after I misnamed the show on a tweet earlier today. That was the real point where we had problems.
But yeah, Bournemouth, I mean, they came up last season. I'm not sure how much of that was down to Scott Parker. They had a very strong squad existing from 2 years previously when they came down from the Premier League. But it was always going to be an uphill task for them. I think the opening day win against Villa was a bit of a shock. It certainly was to me. But then having 3 games like he has done since then, City, Liverpool, and I can't remember who the third one was.
Arsenal.
Good Arsenal, yeah. I mean, it's not going to get much tougher than that. So it feels like it's harsh on Parker, but it's also quite a good time to bring in a new manager because you actually have those harder games out of the way, technically, and you might have an easier run there. I think they've got a good chance of staying up if they get the right man in, but they don't want to do what teams like Watford did last season and bring in people who are quite obviously short-term appointments. They need someone who is going to get them out of the trouble straight away. I think Sean Dyche could be a name maybe linked. He probably doesn't play the same style of football as Bournemouth are used to, but it could be a tactic to keep Bournemouth in the Premier League in the short term over a season or so, but maybe not the right man in terms of tactics, but maybe the right man in terms of experience.
I mean, I personally do think Bournemouth are going straight back down. I think I'm seeing them as very much now the Norwich Yo-Yo Club. They're doing a lot of work behind the scenes. It sounds like there's a new training ground along the way. Obviously, it's a stadium that needs potential expansion down there as well. That very much feels where the club's preference is right now. And yeah, it seems like Parker's like, we need to strengthen. The only way you can strengthen the Premier League these days really is to spend money. And if the board are diverting any money and excess funds, that is limited by the smaller stadium that they have there. It's not like you've got a 30,000 seat stadium that you're going to be pulling in the money with each week. Unfortunately, Parker has got great ambitions to be certainly a higher manager in this league. He's not going to be able to keep a team up that's woefully been underinvested in.
And that frustration must be even bigger when you see a team like Nottingham Forest bring in about 42 players. So I think that he probably then feels, well, Forest are doing it. Why can't I be backed and get these players in? But it could be down to the Bournemouth chairman or ownership not trusting Parker to be that man with the money. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a fair point, I think. I mean, we're in a slightly strange situation where, people from other countries look at the Premier League and look at the amount of money that teams are spending, and it's true that certain clubs are spending big. But you look at Leicester, they haven't, hardly bought anyone. You look at Bournemouth, and there are clubs that are having to really kind of, cut their cloth, I think. And it's sort of little mini cycles within the league. I think some clubs are, really, like look at Spurs, who for years almost refused to sign anyone, and now they really have. So yeah, like you said, Graham, I think Bournemouth might be looking for a slightly longer term thing. And yeah, there's no point buying a load of players on big contracts and still going down, which we've definitely seen happen in the Premier League and before.
Especially with how financial fair play plays out in the Championship. But we don't need to talk about that with the team who are top of the Championship and how they dealt with financial fair play. Anything else from this week's action across the Premier League that caught your eye? I mean, we went into last weekend talking about West Ham potentially being the current crisis club, but good victory for them means that they've probably lost that misnomer for now. Try saying that one once you've had a few. But Is someone stepping into that breach now that really we should be looking at and going, is time potentially ticking for them instead?
The team they beat, Aston Villa. I think we know they aren't the only crisis club. I think Leicester City obviously struggling at the moment, Everton, etc. But Villa at the moment under Gerrard, I mean, since losing to West Ham last March, they played 15 Premier League games. They've won 12 points from those games, winning 3 of them, and 2 of those were against Norwich and Burnley. So they've actually won, over that period, they've won 2 points fewer than Burnley, who were relegated and have played 3 games less. It's never a good sign. But as we said, not the only club. They've won more than Wolves and Southampton over that period, but they have played a game more. The worry for Villa is, and we talk about Bournemouth playing those difficult teams in a short spell of time, the next 2 games for Villa are Arsenal and Man City. And then the third game in that run is against Leicester City, fellow crisis club. So the next 3 games, you feel that actually Gerrard could be under real pressure if they don't manage to win at least 3 points from those 3 games. Considering that they've spent a fair bit of money, haven't they, Villa? I know they've had some bad luck with Diego Carlos getting injured. They spent 26 million on, but they have also spent a lot of money on players like Philip Coutinho, etc. this summer after his loan spell.
Coutinho's an interesting one because I think a lot of Villa fans would much rather Emi Buendia was in the team, and obviously at the moment he just keeps coming on and generally is better when he comes on. And that system that Gerrard has, the sort of Christmas tree, very narrow. It's not really creating that many chances as we saw in that XG map as well. I think, yeah, it is. he might be playing a Christmas tree, but he might not be a manager at Christmas at this rate. But
do you think Gerrard is given more time because of his standing as a player?
Yeah, I think so. And I think last season there was a weird thing where Villa actually played quite well in a couple of big TV games. So like that, I think they played well against Manchester United and a couple of others. And I think people kind of thought, oh yeah, Villa are doing quite well. But then in a lot of the kind of bread and butter games, they were losing. So I think the Villa fans who obviously watch them week in, week out have probably seen, the more real output from Gerrard's managerial career. And let's not forget, Beale went to QPR in the summer, and he obviously was, part of the brains behind the scenes. And we've definitely seen examples in the past of, football managers who lose their number twos. And, even someone like Brian Clough was never quite as good without Peter Taylor as he was with him. So, it's quite concerning.
If Villa lose those next two games against Arsenal and Man City, Gerrard has the same points per game ratio in the Premier League at Villa as Dean Smith did, 1.15. So he's hardly done spectacular there. And I know he did well at Rangers, but at that period, Celtic I know they'd won a lot of titles in a row, but it felt like actually they were kind of ready. Rangers were ready to take that crown, and he built a really good defensive side there. But how much can you gauge a manager's strengths when their only job is being a manager of an old firm team in Scotland? I don't know too much yet about that. So I think, it could be, he could be the next manager, I think, to go.
Maybe you should be the next manager of Dundee United, and then you can find out a bit more about the Scottish scene.
I wouldn't lose 9-0.
You wouldn't
Bold.
go I think it was something like 27 goals in 5 games or something like that Jack Ross has conceded at Dundee United, making his stay very short and very sweet. There was that great moment where they're like
AZ Alkmaar, didn't they?
That was the high point, and then it just went off a cliff. I mean, it's not been a good time for them. Not been a good time for Jack Ross either. Not been a particularly good time for former Sunderland managers as well, with Alex Neil obviously departing Sunderland this week to take up the new role at Stoke City. Time where he said he's not been backed by the board, but in the same week Sunderland go and sign a player from Paris Saint-Germain. I mean, that's pretty good backing of the board there, I think. But anyway, that's not for us to decide, because the games are coming thick and fast this week in the Premier League. We've literally just finished off match day 4 and we're rolling into match day 5. And of course, the supercomputer has been out and about doing all its wonderful gigs, as you would expect. We always love to see.
It's not been out and about. It would be irresponsible letting it outside, because if it rained on it, it would damage it. But it's been whirring fast, calculating a lot of games, definitely. So there's some good matches this midweek. Had to hastily edit the Bournemouth bit this morning. What has Scott Parker got up his sleeve? Don't know. P45 maybe.
So let's have a little roll through some of the predictions for this week. I mean, there is some. Duncan is the expert in talking to the supercomputer. I don't think I've ever seen it turn out a lower score than 3.4% for someone over the past year and a half that we've got. Year and a bit we've got to know this computer intimately and very well. But pretty much writing off any hope of a Forest victory in that one on the road against Manchester.
The supercomputer can't grasp how many signings Forest have made. It's just returning error. It can't be right, surely.
Well, as we pointed out in the piece, Nottingham Forest were the club that brought the Haaland family to English football back in 1993 when they signed Alfie Inga. They might regret that. I mean, there is talk maybe that Haaland might be rested for this one, with Alvarez getting a run out, which would make sense because he hasn't got the most perfect injury record. You don't want to run him into the ground in August. But even if that happens, he could still come off the bench. And I'm mused that Forest might live to regret bringing the Haaland family into our orbit.
I think it's also worth pointing out Newcastle there. I mean, our supercomputer won't factor in kind of financial strength and maybe recent signings. It's based on a lot of it based on power rankings, which obviously stem over many seasons. So Newcastle's recent rise to possibly into the top 6 this season, etc., probably isn't factored in full consideration there. So, like, my personal opinion, obviously, I wouldn't like to go against the supercomputer, is that Newcastle have a better chance than that at Anfield this week.
But
Yeah, but they've not won there since 1994. And in that period, sorry, Graham, probably stole that out of your face. But they in that period they still have been, like that includes the period when Newcastle were challenging for titles. So it is a bit of a bogey ground for them. And they have only won one game this season, and they did nearly lose to Wolves. So I think the supercomputer is 9% probably a little bit low, but I think if Liverpool continue to create chances like they did on Saturday, then, and to be fair, they did create a lot of chances in their other home game against Crystal Palace, even though they didn't win it. So yeah, it should be a good game. And obviously that game has got a lot of Premier League history to it. The famous 4-3, and then I remember Sky putting it on the following year, thinking it would end 4-3, and it actually did, which was statistically quite annoying and unlikely. But no one does 4-3s anymore. It's all about 9-0 these days.
Yeah, I was just thinking of it. It really is the Premier League game under floodlights, Liverpool versus Newcastle. Oh, lovely stuff to maybe tune in for that one there. Another game I just want to bring up at the very bottom of that chart. And I was considering that this is a club that we've talked about, Brendan Rodgers again. The fire is slightly warming up here. I didn't expect Scott Parker to fall in it as quickly as he did. But the managerial hot seat has been warming up to my side, and we have mentioned from early in the season Brendan Rodgers could be one of those people whose butt might be getting a little bit warm. And then our supercomputer turned around and said, well, no, don't worry about it. Leicester are my favourites to beat Manchester United. Now, Leicester are creating chances. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I still just don't see this. I just think this is quite comfortably Manchester United 1 or 2-0. Nothing really to write home about. The pressure building on Leicester. I was very surprised by the supercomputer's call here.
I wasn't, I don't think. Leicester have got a pretty good record against Manchester United. Obviously, they beat them 5-3 in that game. And Di Maria scored that lovely little scoop chip goal. They beat them 4-2 last season. They've got, again, this is a really sort of decent fixture year in, year out, I think, in the Premier League. These sort of two sides do tend to suit each other in terms of serving up a good game. Manchester United weren't great against Liverpool. They sort of hung on. It was more defensive errors, and they weren't great again at Southampton. Their pass completion in the second half was 64%. They essentially brought on Casemiro to act like a kind of Lee Catamol figure for the last 15 minutes. So yeah, I mean a draw is tempting with this game. I think, but I do think Leicester have got as good a chance as winning as Manchester United do, just because they're both pretty inconsistent, but they both have players who could turn the game. I think obviously team selection is a big thing for United in this one. Does Erik ten Hag give Casemiro his first start? You imagine he probably will, which could probably tip the balance, I guess. But yeah, I think obviously this game's on Thursday night, so it's the only one on Thursday. I think it's going to be a pretty interesting one to keep an eye on.
Duncan, are you tagging him as Casamol? Is that his new?
Lee Casamol, yeah, maybe, yeah. It just needs to pull his shorts up.
Casamole sounds better.
Sounds like a Pyrenean dish, but yeah, okay, fine.
Sounds like something we might all be eating. Sounds like something we might all be eating come about January, February when the bills go through the roof. I'll be honest with you. Yeah. One thing I just wanted to sort of drag a little bit of attention to, obviously. No showboating on the show, please. We don't want to get anybody too riled up about that. But Kevin De Bruyne are obviously closing very much in on a potential overtaking of some Premier League assist records at the moment. He's really turning in the performances. And against Forest, I mean, I'm not expecting him to ratchet up the 3 that would see him match Steven Gerrard's record in one game, but hey-ho, you never know. Yeah, I mean, superlatives have been shared about Kevin De Bruyne quite a lot, and a former Arsenal legend gave him one of the greatest comparisons I think I've heard in quite a long while about who De Bruyne could be compared to.
I'm just trying to think of a player in the modern day that would really play like Paul. I suppose maybe De Bruyne is a close fit to, well, Paul Gascoigne would play. Paul was a bit more physical, so he'd like to be physical, not get that not just that physical contact. De Bruyne is not so physical; it's more technical. But Paul could do what De Bruyne did, the goals that De Bruyne makes and scores and creates. So that's the type of player he was.
Good comparison.
Yeah.
Basically saying Gaza was just more pigeon-chested.
I mean, yeah, De Bruyne doesn't get enough credit for his running with the ball. He does do it more than people think. You know, people focus on his passing and shooting, but he's surprisingly a bit like Gascoigne, actually. Fair play, Paul Davis. It's surprisingly fast, like faster than you think. So, yeah, I think that's a reasonable comparison. I mean, it's funny that Gaz has mentioned, because obviously, and you mentioned the showboating, Graham, briefly there. There's nothing wrong with that.
No.
You know, people saying, "Oh, but if you've not played the game," but if you haven't played the game, you're a fan, and that's the sort of thing fans remember and want to talk about for years to come. Do you remember the game when this happened? And also, Gaza did that all the time, and people love that when it's a video on YouTube of, "Oh, look what Gaza." The streaks won't forget what Gaza did against Ipswich or whatever it was. But now, when someone does it, a contemporary player does it, it's a disgrace.
But also, Richarlison just did 3 keepy uppies. How's that showboat thing? It's not like he stood on the ball and did the old Kanchelskis thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you've got Jimmy
Yeah,
Kebe for Reading did the pulling up the socks against West Ham United that every Reading fan still remembers as like one of the great moments of their Premier League history. And
I remember Nathan Tyson scoring for Wycombe when he rounded the goalkeeper and the ball was sort of rolling towards the goal, and he got down on, you know, slid along the ground and headed it in, and the John Gorman, the Wycombe manager at the time, said that was disrespectful. But again, and then I said, why? I didn't see why it's disrespectful. It's a valid way of scoring a goal. And I remember that goal. I can't remember hardly any of his other goals because, you know, that's how memory works.
Yeah, it was just a ridiculous overreaction. I'm quite obviously not Richardson's biggest fan, as people probably found out on Twitter a few months ago when I said that he had a lower minutes per goal ratio than Solomon Rondon and Andre Gray. But there's nothing wrong with that. Like, you want to see players doing that, but also equally you want to see players crunching players that do that because it's quite funny.
Yeah,
So.
yeah.
The
Maybe
Richarlison
it's just checking the
handle-
pressure of the ball or something.
it was just great football. It was a great footballing moment. I think we can all agree on that. Right then, just to very quickly round up the show today, for those of you who don't know, Duncan and I do produce another podcast called Stats Out of Context that we've rolled through our first series of episodes. We're coming back with series 2 very soon, probably as we roll in towards that World Cup in the winter. But one thing we would, just to give you a little flavour of it, let's have a little chat about season's 4 games in, obviously, and sort of, you know, it's a very strange 4 games. Normally we get to like the 3rd game and we roll into an international break, but this time we're sort of going to roll through the 4th and the 5th very quickly. And this is absolutely nothing to do with the fact that we prepared the podcast to go out after the match day 4 and then very quickly realised match day 5 came like a day later. Nothing to do with that at all.
That's just a coincidence, yeah. Just a coincidence.
But I mean, right now we're talking about tables. We're saying about how Leicester are at the bottom and such like. Has it? And I mean, there is always a case of do you wait like 6 games to start really talking about a league table, or where is the point that we should talk about what a league table, how it actually is going to reflect the season rather than it just being earlier than it should be?
Well, there's a lot of nonsense spoken about it. Like people, see some managers say, "Yeah, I'm not going to look at the table till 10 games in." It's like, well, hope Scott Parker did, because otherwise we'd be very confused this morning. But also that people kind of make out that in the olden days, that no one looked at league tables. I literally, if you said to someone in August or September the words league table, they would be like, no, I can't ever. That's not for me. But I found evidence that in 1888, the first league season, the papers were publishing the table after 2 games. So essentially, it's never been a thing. And you know, as soon as teletext came out, whenever that was, in the 70s, I guess, that had league tables after 1 game. So it's not true, essentially, that thing.
But can we introduce anything from? I mean, obviously, right now everybody's talking about Arsenal. 4 wins from 4, incredible. If they go to make it 5 wins from 5, that's only happened 3 times previously in their top flight history. Twice they've won the league doing that, and the other time they finished 2nd. So, you know, nice for those sort of history fans and such like to have those sort of things. But what about after 4 games? Like, where does it stand there?
So 76 teams before this season have started with 4 out of 4. only 23 of them have gone on to win the title. The most recent, Liverpool in 2019-20, when they pretty much won every game until they mysteriously lost Watford, although I believe it was on February 29th, so it doesn't count officially. But yeah, I mean, Chelsea, when 4 of their 5 Premier League titles have seen them start with 4 wins, so for them it's a good thing. But there's loads of teams that start with 4 wins and then fade away. I mean, Matt, you might remember in 2018-19, Watford started with 4 wins out of 4 and came 11th, which is good, but obviously, faded a bit. Even 2 seasons ago, Everton and Villa both started with 4 wins out of 4. They're like that now, and they came 10th and 11th respectively. So it is too early to sort of make judgments on where a team's going to finish. Like, we can't say Arsenal are definitely going to win the league, but we know they're not going to get relegated because no team has ever won 4 out of 4 and gone down. So Arsenal are safe, which is big news from.
The season Watford won 4 out of 4. Obviously, that was the season they ended up going to the FA Cup final, had the best Premier League season. The next season, Watford board obviously thought, well, hang on, why have we not done this again? Because they sacked Javi Gracia after 4 games the next season. So obviously wasn't good enough. He stitched himself up.
And what happened at the end of that season?
Don't know. COVID
happened. Are you basically saying if Javi Gracia hadn't been sacked,
Yeah.
COVID would not have been a thing?
It's their fault.
It's a theory.
What about... Go on, Doug.
No, go on.
Well, what about other teams? Like, I mean, we're talking about 4 wins. Any other streaks of 4 that sort of bring together sort of things like, okay, so have sides ever drawn 4 to start a season, for example?
Yeah, there's been 10 instances of 4 draws, which is kind of, I guess, is that the worst start to a season? At least if you're losing, you can build up a sort of head of steam of hatred, I guess, with the fan or the board. 4 draws. Yeah, the only team to go down after drawing the opening 4 games are Palace back in 1993, back in the era when they just did always go down every time they got to the top flight. There was Wolves in 1947-48. They scored 20 goals in their first 4 games, which is even better than Liverpool this season. But they came 5th, so it didn't really count for that much in the end. Didn't even get a Europa League spot because it didn't exist. So, yeah, I think, it is very early in the season. Obviously, by the end of today, some teams will have played 5, so we're rattling through the games. And I think that's probably the bigger thing, really. I think there are some parallels with 2 seasons ago when that was the season that started behind closed doors and we're still in the midst of COVID. And you remember, obviously, Liverpool lost to Villa. And it's interesting because then they they drew at Everton, didn't they? But that was the game that Van Dijk got injured and it sort of really derailed their season. Liverpool have got, obviously, at the weekend, they're away at Everton again. So I always think every Premier League season has a kind of mirror. So there's always a couple of seasons that kind of are quite similar. And it does, so far, this season does feel quite sort of 2020, 21 to me. But as we say, is quite early.
Well, we covered Tom Hancock's piece earlier in the season, covered as also like the first 5 games. If you win 8 or more points, that seems to be the golden number, doesn't it? That your chances of staying up are dramatically increased. That doesn't help teams like Bournemouth, who in your first 5 games play Man City, Liverpool, Arsenal. But it feels like, especially if you're a newly promoted team or a team that are perceived to be a struggling team, if you've done well in that first 4 games, it usually coincides with just a few days before the end of the transfer window. So you're either able to bring in a better quality of player because players will probably go, well, actually, they're probably not going to go down if they've started really well. Or if you're a bigger club that's struggling after those 4 games, that is when those teams sort of panic buy, don't they, and bring in players. I remember Arsenal that season when they brought in Mertesacker. I think they brought 4 players.
Benayoun, Arteta,
yeah. So that the first 4 games feels like it really does shape your season based on the transfer window now.
Yeah, and just to bring it back round to what we started talking about today, in that list of managers to go early in the season was Alan Kirbishley at West Ham. And bizarrely, he has never properly managed a club since 2008 when he left there. But obviously, he was at Charlton before. In 2005-06, Charlton started with 4 wins out of 4. And that season was interesting because they were still pretty high up around Christmas, but they really fell away after that. And, Kirbishley basically resigned because the fans had got sort of fed up. And I remember there was a sort of, we need to establish ourselves and get into the UEFA Cup on a regular basis. It's kind of careful what you wish for because, since then it's been a slow fading away for Charlton. But So yeah, I think if you're a club like Arsenal this season, 4 wins out of 4 probably suggests that you might have a reasonable title bid. But when it is, say, a Charlton or a Watford, you should probably just be grateful that you've got 12 points that on the board that early, and it does give you some security. And I guess
it's more like we've got 12 points of the 40 needed. Ticks off. It's kind of
yeah.
And we talk about transfer window. Obviously, it closes 11 o'clock Thursday night. So probably not helpful for someone like Manchester United, who obviously play the Thursday night. So if it all of a sudden is a disaster, for example, say there's a major injury occurs Thursday, they haven't got a lot of time to maybe dash around and run and try and fix something. But say something...
Got an hour.
Yeah.
Get that fax machine.
They'll only be able to sign Leicester players. Please, can anyone join us?
I think even if it wasn't plugged in, it would be pretty cool to have a fax machine on the bench next to the manager, just as a sort of like, we're working out what to do here. We can do a transfer mid-game if needs be. So
maybe fax machines as a whole are going to make a huge comeback, because maybe they're cheaper to run than desktop computers and email servers. So maybe we're about to, really embrace the old times again. With
Amstrad email phone for me, but yeah.
Alan Sugar rubbing his hands.
Well, I don't quite know where to go from there. So I think there's only one thing we can do, and that's try and wrap up today's show. Thanks very much for joining us as ever. If you aren't able to catch us live or you're watching us on repeat, then make sure you can also download to our podcast feed where we upload the show, and is also where we host Stats Out of Context when it makes its glorious return for season 2 very soon. There's loads of great content as ever over on The Analyst. As we mentioned at the start of today's show, you can go and check out the earliest Premier League sackings piece that is now live on the site, as well as the latest Premier League predictions. The stats hubs are all up to date as well, so you can dive in and have a look around all the great data that we have online for you too. And don't forget to head over to our social media channels. You've got us on Instagram, you've got us on TikTok, and you've got us on Twitter, all of them at Opta Analyst. But for now, enjoy another Madcap week of Premier League football. We'll be back at the end of the week, no doubt. Looking forward to match day 6. But until then, on behalf of Duncan and Matt, thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll catch you again soon. Take care.